Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron. Well, it hasn't been much time since my last update video, but the build has leapt forward in that short amount of time, and we are at the 1 week mark into the league, so it felt appropriate to get that next video out. As advertised in the previous one, which I will link in the description, I did indeed make the changeover from the basic Chaos Inoculation version of the build to the version with Nebulous, Melding of the Flesh, max resistances, all that good stuff. And I've got to say, nice. The transition was far cheaper and went far faster than expected, and it feels amazing. The enemies are dying much faster than before, and even the really tough ones that manage to stay alive for a little while have a hell of a time doing any damage to me. I've been progressing through the new main Pinnacle boss questline, and so I don't want to give too many spoilers about that, because I know that it's got some plot significance that players might want to get to on their own. So instead, I will include some footage of me fighting some familiar faces, some bosses that have been around for a while, just to kind of keep it spoiler-free. As you can see in the footage, and as I've tried to be upfront about all along, this is not a Pinnacle boss deleting build. It was never meant to be. This footage is against normal, non-Uber bosses, unless you count Uber Catarina, who you'll see my mercenary and I both die against, though I do come and get her in the end. Just a little bit more slowly on the damage front once the mercenary goes down. He's also wearing a Shaper's Seed amulet, which helps with my regen, and you're going to see that could come in handy, so I'm going to have to see what I can do to try to keep him alive better. So, no, the main focus of the build is not bossing, never was. Instead, it tends to come down to tightly packed areas, lots of enemies grouped up together. That's where it really shines. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's a one-trick pony. As you can see, Arc's whole gimmick of dealing more damage to enemies earlier in the chain sequence, combined with the fact that we are extremely tanky and able to absorb several deadly hits, combined again with the fact that this is a damage over time build, meaning we only have to hit enemies every few seconds for them to be constantly taking damage. All that means that the boss playstyle is pretty comfortable, if not necessarily speedy. The reason that I died against Catarina is that I am just, as I've said many times, just not a very good build pilot. In this video, I just frequently didn't notice that I was standing in the kind of dark black and green damage over time circle on the ground. There is a little bit of visual clutter with the build, with the golems running all around, so that's part of it, but really it's on me. I just needed to notice that and step out of it. Even with capped resistances at, well, for me it's 89 at the moment, you still don't want to stand in that nasty stuff, and if I am going to stand in that nasty stuff, well, I should have brought Vol Discipline along with me to maybe counteract that long enough that I could that I could figure out where I was and get out of it. But in any case, that's not the main strength of the build, but it can still do okay at bossing, as you've seen, and non-Pinnacle bosses, things like Guardians and stuff like that, easy peasy, no trouble at all. So anyways, what specifically did I change to the build? What did these recent changes consist of? Well, I followed the plan that I'd laid out. Actually, I followed it to a T. I got down to business in Path of Building, just calculating how far down my resistances and max resistances were going to go when taking Melding of the Flesh. How many nodes I was going to have to unspec and respec to make room for all these jewel sockets I suddenly needed to get my max cold resistance up. And then I was also, as I was doing this, I was also pricing out some cluster jewels. I was pricing out the base jewels that I was going to need. And then finally, once I had kind of slotted all that other stuff into place, I was like, all right, I got this mostly taken care of. I left my belt for last as kind of a flex spot. What I mean by that is that I knew that this would be the slot that would be most flexible, that I could get a ton of whatever resistances were lacking once I had taken care of the cluster jewels and the base jewels and all that stuff. Those other spots were going to be more finicky. I might have to settle for like a cluster jewel that doesn't have resistance on it or whatever. So I knew that my belt was going to be where I could do the final shoring up. Also, since I knew that I was going to be taking a Stygian Vice, I could also use the Abyssal Jewel in the Stygian Vice to kind of do the same thing if needed. And all that worked out. It worked out great, better than great. You can see that other than against Uber Catarina, the build is really rolling on a budget of under 20 divines. At least in that first week economy, it's under 20 divines. No one can say what the prices are going to do from here on out, both in general and like if a lot of people are playing this build. So I can't make any guarantees about what the item prices will look like. All I can do is tell you that I paid less than 20 divine for this stuff. And that's all it took to take the build from good enough to feels amazing. Rocketing through maps, blowing up whole screens. It's awesome. And one of the keys to success, the thing that kind of helped everything else lock in place together, was finding a small cluster jewel on trade. That I was looking for one that had mono reservation efficiency, of course, and the increased effect of small nodes. Well, I managed to find one that had 2 relatively high rolled resistances that it was going to add with each of these 3 nodes that I was taking. And at the time when I bought it, one of these was cold resistance, which I wasn't really going to need because I was adding in purity of ice to get my maximum cold resistance up, and purity of ice adds a bunch of base cold resistance, so I didn't need that. But what I did was just chuck it in the harvest bench and change that cold over to fire, so now the jewel is fire and lightning, which is exactly what I needed, and it totals up to giving me around 45 total resists. And this is an item that I was gonna need to take anyways for the mono-res, so the fact that I could get an extra chunk of 45 resistance on it was amazing. Editing Baron here, I realized that I had not gone through Path of Building and actually told you what these changes have meant for the damage and defenses of the build. So just very briefly, coming over to the skills section, this is where I've got all the level 1 awakened skill gems. You could theoretically switch out Swift Affliction for Deadly Ailments to gain an extra second or so on the duration of the Ignite, but at the loss of some damage. I don't consider that worth it. I'm very happy with Swift Affliction as it is. So the DPS it's showing right now, if you are just running around casting your normal arc the normal way. But what happens if you hit a Vol arc? What goes on with the Ignite with that? Well, before we click that option, what we actually need to do is come over to the tree and deactivate Elemental Overload. And the reason for that is because we are not going to have Elemental Overload for Vol Arc. It's considered a separate skill than Arc. So now we can disable Arc, enable Vol Arc, and we go up from 4 million to 6 million damage. So that is a very hefty, chunky improvement when we throw out Vol Arc there. And if we come over to the configuration page, we can see some of the things contributing to that are my Cinder Swallow Urn is giving. So Cinder Swallow Urn, the game does not calculate malediction correctly, or the POB doesn't, so I added it here. The Rune Graft, this Global Defense Rune Graft is amazing. And then here's the Mercenary stats. I should apply, I've got Temporal Chains on the build, I should put that in here, but it doesn't matter for offense. You could actually get even more offense at the cost of some defense. So right now, effective hit pool is 215,000 with a physical max hit of 18,500. Now, that is with Aegis Aurora active here. If we were to pretend we weren't wearing a shield that gave us energy shield every time we blocked, our EHP will go down, but our max hits won't. EHP goes down to only, quote unquote, 121,000. But with Aegis, you're at 215,000 because you are going to be blocking approximately 75% of the hits. And the max hit is a really important one, the ability to negate that one big slam coming in. As you've seen from the footage, this is accurate. But in any case, if you wanted to give up some of this, you could take away some energy shield, armor, and reduced extra damage from critical strikes. You could say, I don't want that, I don't want these, and instead I want this Divine Judgment. So then you go up to, let's see, we've got to have Elemental Overload back in the game. So with Elemental Overload and Arc, you're at 4.7, not 4 million when you make this change. That's pretty substantive. So you're getting whatever the percentage 700,000 is of 4 million, respectable. You have lost some effective hit pool, so it's a trade-off. I would say that if you're in very rippy content, you can do the extra defenses here, but otherwise you're more than welcome to go offense. And then we can check what Vol Arc will be. We'll go from 4.7, take off that Elemental Overload, enable Vol Arc, up to 6.8. Another very nice, very big jump. So yeah, the upgrades have clearly had a great effect on the build. The other thing to mention is that I've still been going back and forth between Flame and Ice Golem. The thing that I discovered is that there is a way to tell in-game when Elemental Overload is active. This is important. So on the skill down here, right at the bottom between the little mouse icon and the L, there will be a little diamond will pop up, a little sideways diamond like this. And when that's there, Elemental Overload is active. And I was tracking it with Flame Golem, who does not give any critical strike chance, just increased damage. And Flame Golem, Elemental Overload was not up as often as I would have wanted. So for the moment, I'm at Ice Golem. Those DPS values that you saw in Path of Building were for Ice Golem. You can experiment with it if you want. If you've got another source of critical strike chance, feel free. The other thing I might consider doing in the build is finding a way to sneak smite back in for those single target situations. Like that Catarina fight would have gone a little bit better if I just... What would happen if I had a Vol smite in the build? Yeah, look, it was the top recommended option. Of course it was. Vol smite to the Arc takes it from 4.7 to almost 6 million. Holy crap. And then for the Vol Arc, would take it up to 9 million. So like, yes, you're only going to be able to do Vol Arc less frequently because it will compete for souls with Vol Smite, but like that's pretty compelling for a, like kind of a one-tap situation. Anyways, it's something to consider. I don't have it in the current state of the build. It's something you could play around with if you wanted. Let me just take a quick look, make sure there's nothing else that I'm missing. I've got flammability here because my mercenary is applying it with his wand. Yeah, I think the rest of this is pretty straightforward, but feel free to ask in the comments. There is one modest-sized thing still missing, though. Like, not even getting into the super endgame stuff, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but just like something that I could be doing in the immediate future is I opted for a cheap melding of the flesh. I paid under 50 chaos for it, but the price that I paid for that in return was that I only got a -5 to max resistance roll. You want the lowest possible number here. You want it to be subtracting as little as possible from your max resistance, and the best possible roll is a -4. That is the minimum that you're going to have to overcome with melding of the flesh. Well, I took a -5 instead of a -4 because the price difference was several divine, to go that 1 point. But the result is that I am still 1 point off my max resistances. I'm at 89 instead of 90, and you know, it is weaker. You know, it may sound like I'm just being obsessive compulsive or something, but I can assure you that's not the case. Not only is that 1 point worth more defensively than you might think, just to tick it up a little bit further, but as I keep saying, the central gimmick of the build, and the reason it's so important not to take the Nebulous Scepter early, is that Nebulous gives you a fat stack of damage for every single point you are above 75 resistances. So even with an imperfect roll on my Nebulous Scepter, getting that 1 extra point of resistance will be worth almost 40% increased damage. Now that's added to the already pretty substantial pile of increased damage that I've got, and you know, eventually of course adding more and more and more sources of just increased damage, that specific portion of the calculation, you start to run into a diminishing returns problem. So, you know, for example, going from 100% increased damage on your build to 200%, that is a big jump for your build overall. But that same jump of 100% going from 1,000 to 1,100, that is a much smaller relative change to your build. And you kind of find yourself asking if there would have been some way to give up that extra 100%, to use those resources somewhere else, whether it's, you know, a suffix on a gear or a jewel or something, finding some other way to use those resources to give yourself flat damage or more damage or ignite burn rate or resistance penetration or something that will be multiplicative, not additive, with that big chunk of increased damage. But in any case, we're not quite at that point of, you know, 40% being just a drop in the bucket. So I do ultimately, I want to get this. I want to max myself up at 90, both for the offensive and defensive reasons. And then there's also a ton of other stuff that we can still look at offensively for this build before getting to the like super duper ultra mega endgame stuff. But like, what are some of the things we can do? You know, we're far from done here. I did already spend a few divines getting level 1 awakened gems. It would have been a lot more to get already leveled awakened gems. The gap in price will go down as the league goes on and people start leveling these things up. But for the moment, early in the league, it's quite expensive to buy level 5 awakened gems. So I bought level 1 as a compromise, and I also bought a bunch of Gem Cutter's Prisms, probably a divine and a half worth. So on gem upgrades alone, I probably spent 3.5 divines getting awakened gems and putting quality on all support gems and all of my golems. But that's really the only other upgrade that I've made there. Some people would go at this point, you'd go to Replica Dragonfang's Flight for you get more damage because you're adding more gem levels to Arc. But that's only if you can handle the attribute needs elsewhere. I'm getting a lot of my attributes on my amulet at the moment. So this might be a spot where you might consider on one of those small cluster jewels like I was talking about, where I got the resistances. Maybe you can get one with a high dexterity roll, which is one of the attributes that's hardest for us to get. And maybe that would allow you to free up your amulet and take Replica Dragonfang's Flight, get even more damage. Now the other more, call it aggressively expensive, that is, endgame option would be a simplex or what's it called, a focused or simplex amulet. These are the heist-specific experimental bases. They limit the number of mods that can roll on it, but they massively increase the potency of those mods. So a focused amulet can roll up to +4 gems, and a simplex can roll up to +2 gems, plus a boatload of damage over time multiplier, like a big boatload. Those are, however, outrageously expensive options. Yes, they are likely the best in slot, but you're not going to be getting those until much further down the line. But what else could we look at other than crazy amulet options? We could look at a lethal pride jewel with good damage mods like Ignite Burn Rate and increased burning damage. We could look at getting better rolls on the Nebula Scepter. You would love to have this be 20/20. You would like to get the better... let's show the Nebulous real quick. You would like to get the better of the two corruptions that are available for the Incandescent Heart. The two that are good for us are the +1 to all socketed gems, and that includes the support gems. And then the other one is +2 duration gems. And the duration one squeaks out the win here. So compared to a non-corrupted version of the chest, my current build would upgrade by about 12% overall damage, adding this +1, and instead, if you had the +2 duration, it would increase by 16 instead of 12. So, you know, you're starting to get into min-max territory, but it is a noticeable difference. Other things you could do, get the new Runecraft of Gemcraft, which gives plus levels to all support gems, or non-awakened support gems, or non-exceptional. I think it includes awakened, but not Enlighten, Enhance, and Power. I don't think Awakened are considered exceptional, but you'd have to check that. In any case, it's very expensive at the moment, but you could go with that. You get a Zoph's Heart Amulet for your Mercenary, because at the moment you have to choose between Curse on Hit and Covered in Ash. In brief, you can either get Covered in Ash from the Ashcaller Wand or the Zoph's Heart Amulet. But if you get it from the Wand, you give up the ability, at least with my Mercenary, who's only got one weapon, you give up the ability to get a Curse on Hit, like I've got Flammability on Hit here. And you might say, well, hey, the Mercenary has Elemental Weakness, but as it turns out, if there is already a curse on the enemy, whether they put it there, whether I put it there, doesn't matter, something in the AI of the Mercenary will not use their native Elemental Weakness skill. It will not detect that they have a +1 skill like they do from Dodre's Damning here. Now, you may notice that I've got 2 Dodre's Damning here. Another thing that I did, actually, was I dropped a pair of Asenath's Gentle Touch myself. They're only worth like 30 chaos, I think. But I slapped them on here and gave him the ability to put yet another curse on the enemy, and this will allow him to inflict temp chains, and this helps me proliferate explosions. My proliferation is still pretty good even without these. You can see it actually in the portion of the clip where I run the rest of that ziggurat map after my Mercenary dies. All that proliferation from there on out, that's just me. My Mercenary's dead, but it is nice. Plus, hey, slowing down enemies with temp chains, I'll take another defensive layer any day of the week. But in any case, things that you could still add to the Mercenary, you could put a Crown of the Tyrant on here. I still haven't nailed down whether or not 2 Eye of Malice is actually doing anything for us, so if anybody's done the math on that, let me know. POB thinks it does, but I don't know if I trust POB on that. I'd like some actual in-game experience. So after that, after the Mercenary, getting more character levels, obviously that's going to be a big deal. You know, you're always going to get more damage from character levels. In my case, I'm probably going to add a 3rd Cluster Jewel setup. That's the way I did it last league. I think it's what I'm going to do again. And that comes with the handy side effect of getting a bonus spare jewel socket, one that I will probably use for Watcher's Eye. And in the meantime, I will also be getting Storm Shroud so that I can get Ailment Immune. That's another defensive upgrade on the horizon. But on the topic of that Watcher's Eye, I'm going to be looking for one that has a Malevolence mod and a Determination mod. That's my preference. But if you've got a lot of money and you feel the defenses are already in a good place, feel free to go with a double Malevolence option. Again, anytime you have 2 effects for the same aura, on the same Watcher's Eye, that's going to be more expensive. So, do make sure that you've got money if you're looking for that. But if you are actually low on money, 1 is fine. Like if you feel you need defense more, get a determination 1. If you feel you need offense more, get a malevolence 1. And that should be reasonably affordable. More stuff on the defensive side, though. Defenses, it would be possible to get a corruption on the Aegis Aurora. Last league, I went with a reduced damage from critical strikes, which was really good. You can combine it with stuff that you take on the tree and get really low, ultimately, damage from critical strikes. We could look at... actually, I only just got this. Where is it? I don't have it equipped right now, but sitting in my stash somewhere is one that I'm going to pop on. A bleeding immunity Call of the Brotherhood. You can do that on 1. And then on the other one, you can do... There's some good corruptions on rings. You could do increased determination effect, increased malevolence effect, whatever you like. Obviously, we don't need immune to poison because we're a chaos inoculation build. But the reason those are expensive, it's not about the rings themselves. Call of the Brotherhood is so common, they get corrupted all the time. You can find one that has the corruption. I think I bought the bleeding one for like 30 chaos. It was nothing. The problem is getting that quality on it. You can't really quality all the rings up and then corrupt them and hope to get something good. I mean, I guess you could. But most people don't. So what you have to do, once it's corrupted and it's got the corruption you want, you have to use tainted catalysts. And tainted catalysts don't tell you what they're going to give you. They randomize both the number of quality and the type of quality. So you're sitting there clicking tainted catalysts, and they can be pretty expensive. Trying to get, at that point, you're not shooting for 20 to quality anymore. You're just like, please let me get something above 15. That's all I want, to convert as much as possible of that lightning damage to cold. So that's expensive, but it's something that you can go with. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet. If the build is awesome now, wait until you see it with a Mage Blood. It frees up our jewel sockets to do so much more damage when you don't have to have all these +2 max cold res jewel sockets. It frees up our boots to no longer need ailment immunity mods on the boots. You can do whatever you want with the boot slot. It doubles our armor, literally doubles it. It turns us into a speed demon. So, listen. Basically, Mage Blood is expensive for a reason. It is a monster of an item, and this build can take full and complete advantage of it, so I am going to be saving up for it. Which actually brings me to close out this video with some good/bad news. It's good for me, potentially bad for the guide. Not really, just depending on whether you trust me or not to keep my word. See, I got lucky. I got really, really lucky. While mapping, I came across a Starfall Crater. And for those of you who didn't play the previous league, Starfall Crater is a random encounter that you can find in maps. It'll show up on your mini-map as one of the usual orange doors, but it's a hole in the ground labeled Starfall Crater. You click in, and it's a random boss encounter. Well, the boss is not random. You face the same boss every time, the Black Knight. I just mean to say that finding this is random. And in that boss has approximately, we think, like a 10% chance to drop the Svalin Shield, the one that gives you Lucky Block, which is incredibly powerful. Well, I'm not going to be using it because I've got my Aegis Aurora, but with Starfall showing up less often this league and defenses being so popular, this shield is insanely expensive right now, meaning that I sold it for 75 Divine and instantly got 2/5 of the way to a Mage Blood. I'll let you enjoy the moment with me in this brief clip. Come on. Give it to me. Boom. So yeah, this is great news for me personally, but I do know that having a Mage Blood puts the build out of reach for a lot of people watching the video, and I don't want to alienate those people. This is intended to be something that you can work towards with a reasonable amount of time. You don't need to know-life the game, so don't worry. First of all, I will continue to produce content and guides that focus on the non-Mage Blood portion of the build. You don't need to worry that that's going to take over how I think you should upgrade. I will describe for people who do go that route, how you can adjust your build based on that, how you can use those newly freed up resources. But I will also make sure that I'm paying attention to those of you who opt not to go for the Mage Blood. But second of all, just to be clear, for the moment, there haven't been any changes to the build that resulted from this enormous 75 Divine windfall. It is not currently impacting the build in any way because I've just invested the entire thing into Apothecary divination cards. So these are essentially fractions of a Mage Blood, and this is recommended when you're saving up for a Mage Blood. It is highly recommended that you do so not in the number of divines you've got in your stash, but by buying these apothecaries. This is because Mage Blood tends to rise in price throughout the opening weeks of a league, and so really what you want to do is, as soon as you can afford a single apothecary, you buy one and bank it, because as the price of Mage Blood goes up, the relative price of apothecary goes up with it. And this is, I mean, like, it's basically accruing value just by sitting there. This is like the difference between having your money in a savings account versus having it in a 401k or whatever. You know, take your pick of investment accounts. It's I am protecting myself against inflation. So you hate that feeling, right? Like you're saving up for a 10 divine upgrade, but by the time you get there, it's actually an 18 divine upgrade. It's the worst. And this is kind of protection against that. So what that means is that all the money that I got is safely tucked away into this, again, equivalent of like a 401k or whatever, and it's just accruing value steadily, and all the rest of the build is just going to have to proceed on my own non-RNG merits, not benefiting from this big drop. So you can trust that the upgrades that I make to this build for the foreseeable future until I do get that Mage Blood, these are ones that don't require you to have dozens of divines to luckily and suddenly fall into your lap. Otherwise, I'm just farming the old-fashioned way. You know, it's not much, but it's honest work. So anyways, I'll close on this happy note. It was really exciting to get that. And then, as advertised before the league started, the update videos starting now will probably kind of slow down from here on out. We're at a week, which is when I said they were probably going to slow down, and I was right. That's about how long it took for the build to reach a cruising altitude. So I'll probably be holding steady with the build as is. I'll make a couple of those upgrades that I mentioned, nothing that costs more than, like, you know, 5 or 10 divines, hopefully, and I'll be banking the rest to try and save up for that Mage Blood. But yeah, in the meantime, if you've got questions about the build or anything else, feel free to drop them in the comments or stop by the Discord if it's something more detailed. Thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.